Hey there, Danny Taylor here, and I'm coming to you from my office. And there are some couple of things that I've been thinking about and just reflecting on recently that I'd like to share with you. If you're anything like me, that's exactly what this whole COVID-19 pandemic has really forced you to do. We've all been sheltering in place, and maybe if you're like me, these unique days have really forced you to kind of sit back and reflect on a number of things that maybe you haven't thought of before. And especially for me as the pastor of a church, I've kind of been thinking about things from that perspective, just maybe rethinking some things pertaining to the corporate body of Christ. There is one institution created and designed by God that has more integrity and more sacredness than anything else you could possibly think of. As far as God Himself is concerned, there is this one institution that has greater worth than anything else you can think of. It is the very bedrock of our society, and it's not what you think. It's actually not the church. I was having this conversation with my father in law a while back, and he reminded me of something. He said, there's one institution that God created that actually predates the church, and it's the family. And this is true, of course, as believers in Jesus Christ, we can't imagine a world without church in some form or another. And we like to pinpoint the birth of the church as being Acts chapter 2, but the family dates back way before that, all the way back to Genesis and the garden. God Himself brought forth the family as an institution with integrity. For the very first time, when He brought Adam and Eve together and they became one flesh, from then on, that's the primary institution that God has used most frequently to bring about His will and to make His name known. It's the family. It was Noah's family that God used to preserve the entire human race. It was Abraham's family that God used to create a family of people through whom He would be a light to the nations. And by the time that we get to Exodus, it's the family that has become the central location for worship. On the night before God's people were to leave Egypt by way of the Red Sea, Moses had these instructions for how they were supposed to celebrate the Passover. In Exodus chapter 12, verse 26, he said, "When your children ask you, 'What do you mean by all this?' That's when the father takes his role in explaining to the children who God is and what God has done for them. By the time that you get to the Ten Commandments, the very first commandment that actually has anything to say about human to human relationships is this one: honor your father and mother. And that's like all the other commandments, that is a commandment that does not have an expiration date. Mom and dad, you're welcome for that one. The integrity of the family as the most sacred institution is actually reflected upon again by when you get to Deuteronomy chapter 6. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, you get these very famous words: "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, your soul, and your might. These are the words that I command you today, and they shall be upon your heart." But the primary responsibility for taking that faith and handing it down to the next generation does not belong to pastors. It does not belong to priests. It belongs to the parents. "You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk about them when you sit in your house. You shall talk about them when you walk by the way. You shall talk about them when you lie down. You shall talk about them when you rise." The primary place for worship in the Old Testament is in the home. And the first and the greatest institution created by God is not the church, it's the family. And this extends even into the New Testament as well, where when you get to the gospel writers and the Apostle Paul, they all reinforce that Old Testament notion of the family as the primary institution upon which the rest of society is built. The Apostle Paul even implies that the family is somehow greater than the church in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 4 and 5. As far as Paul is concerned, one of the prerequisites to any person being a pastor is that he has to manage his family well. If someone does not know how to manage his family, how can he manage God's church? Now, I know what some of you are thinking at this point. Some of you are thinking, whew, man, I'm so glad Danny Taylor just let me off the hook from ever having to go to church again. I always knew that I didn't need to belong to a local church. Stop. The church actually has immense value and incredible dignity. Jesus promised that he was going to build his church, and that his church would be able to storm the gates of hell without the gates of hell stopping it. And the idea of any individual Christian believer not belonging to the universal church expressed in a local church, that idea is completely foreign to the New Testament. Indeed, there are many situations and contexts around the world where the people who make up the church, the body of Christ, are more family than some people's own flesh and blood. And it's because the family is the first and most sacred institution that God created does not render the church irrelevant. And it doesn't give us license to abandon the corporate gathering of the people of God. It does, however, enable us to see the reality and the integrity of church in its proper perspective. The church, the corporate gathering of the people of God, is at its greatest when her nuclear families are strong and vibrant. Worship happens first and foremost in the context of the home and the family. And this is something that I've had to reconsider and remember while being sheltered in place. I have found it very difficult in recent weeks to fulfill all of the duties associated with being the pastor of a church. It's been hard. It really has. But these days have also provided me with a reminder that my primary duty is to my family. We should not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing. But as long as we can't meet together, we can still worship together in our homes and with our families the way God originally designed it. After all, God created the family long before he created the church. And when the church does gather together again, it will be stronger if right now we take seriously our families, created, ordained, and given dignity by God himself. What my church needs is a good pastor. But they will only get that if I am first the husband and the father my family deserves. And by God's grace, may your families be pastored well by you. And in doing so, may we create a stronger church, a stronger community, and a stronger world. Hey, I love you, and may you be blessed this week, and take care of your families. And praying for you. Love you. And Danny Taylor is out.